Greg, the New York Times reports today that President Obama's advisors are coalescing around a strategy. Would you explain what that strategy for Afghanistan seems to be?
Sure. It's basically a variation on what General McChrystal said he wants to do, which is focus on the major population centers. Now, the question is sort of how do you define those? There are 10 or so big cities that I think everyone agrees these are places where you can extend the reach of the Afghan government, where you can stabilize them. Then there are a bunch of places like Nuristan, Kunar province, that these are very remote areas where extending the reach of the Afghan government is probably a 50-year project. And I think everyone agrees that those are bridges too far. The question is these areas in the middle between those two extremes, and how much of an effect can you have in these areas in terms of extending the reach of good governance, growing an economy, all the things you need to do to defeat an insurgency.
Now, you actually wrote a series of articles recently about one of the remote areas in which there had been American troops. It didn't work out well, and I think that was a situation that helped lead to the strategy that the Obama administration seems to be leaning toward now. Tell us about Wanat, the area in which there were American troops. I think 9 American soldiers were killed within a few hours, one day. So tell us about Wanat and the lesson there.
Well, I mean, essentially what you had was you pushed U.S. troops into this very remote valley in a place called Nuristan province, which is one of the most remote and isolated areas in Afghanistan. It was the last to convert to Islam. And the troops got in there, and they were pursuing sort of classic counterinsurgency. In fact, the battalion commander is a guy named Bill Ostlund, who's a protege of General Petraeus. General Petraeus thinks very highly of him. Ostlund is a exceptionally bright, hardworking, ambitious officer. He pushes U.S. troops into this valley in Wanat with the goal of, hey, I'm going to protect these people from themselves. I'm going to connect them to the Afghan government so they're less of a threat to themselves, they're less of a threat to Afghanistan. But the problem was that this little valley, I think, had no history of kind of any connection to the outside world, and it desperately didn't want it. So it provoked a massive attack, as many as 200 enemy fighters, a mix of outsiders and some Taliban and a lot of locals who really pounded U.S. forces and drove U.S. forces from the valley. And they haven't returned in going on 15, 16 months now.
So you say that this battle in Wanat has come to symbolize the military's missteps in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting case, too. I mean, since the U.S. military has left Wanat, they've moved about 6 miles down the valley. An interesting thing has happened. I mean, the locals actually are living with some of the Taliban commanders who prosecuted this attack. And now they're beginning to express frustration with the Taliban, who they also see as outsiders. I mean, these are incredibly insular and remote places. And it really goes to a question of, can you transform these places, which is sort of the debate we've been having since 2003 with regard to Iraq. I mean, I think General Abizaid is one of the more skeptics that these places are complex and different and foreign, and you can shape them on the margins, but you can't change them. General Petraeus in the counterinsurgency crowd tends to be a lot more ambitious and thinks, hey, you really can transform these places. Right now, at least within the Army, the counterinsurgents are ascendant.
I think one of the big fears is if the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, which we're very unlikely to do right now, that it could become a safe haven for the Taliban and therefore a safe haven for Islamic extremists from around the world. On the other hand, if we have troops in major cities but we pull out of the remote regions, do those remote regions become a safe haven for the Taliban and other extremists? And do they form almost like little mini-states or mini-governments in those remote regions and just wait there patiently until eventually the United States does pull out?
Yeah, I mean, that's the concern. That's certainly possible. I mean, in fact, I would say, hey, there are already havens right now. I mean, the Taliban or sort of Taliban surrogates already run places like Nuristan or some of the more remote regions of southern Afghanistan. I mean, the question is, can we build sort of a coherent Afghan state in the major cities at the same time this sort of threat lurks on the periphery? And it's an unanswerable question right now, and it's a pretty big gamble. I mean, it's a gamble, though, we have to take because I don't think there's any real possibility of us finding the troops or the willpower to sort of transform some of these more remote areas.